Okay, well, it is now 10:01, so we're going to go ahead and get started. So hello and good morning again to everyone. Thank you for joining TPMA as we kick off our first webinar of 2022. My name is Megan Wagner, and I'm the Director of Diversity, Equity, Inclusion, and Business Partnerships here at TPMA. I'm so excited for today's topic around digital divide, digital equity, and digital literacy is becoming a huge and major discussion across the nation and in our communities. So to kick things off, I would like to introduce, our panelists and team members too as well. I'll let them jump in first. In this case, we have Paula Gutierrez joining us. Paula, do you want to share a little bit about yourself and your background?
Yes, thank you so much. So yes, I'm Paula with the South Carolina Office of Rural Health. I will be with them for 4 years in April. I reside in upstate South Carolina, and in the positions I've held in different organizations since I moved back to the US in 2011, I've served rural areas. My time at SCORE, the South Carolina Office of Rural Health, has been without a doubt the most in-depth rural experience that I've had. And during this time, I've discovered great rural towns and resources that they have. I've also seen a lot of opportunities in my role on how to best improve quality of life through multiple focus areas. And I truly enjoy what I do. Thank you.
And thank you, Paula. I've had the honor of working with Paula more recently and joining the collaborative work that she is doing. So thank you so much for joining us today. Also, we have joining us is Gary Brantley, and I'll pause for a second before Gary gives his professional background. Just so you all know, Gary Brantley is actually my cousin. I like to say he's my older cousin joining us today, but I'm very proud and excited to have Gary joining us. And it's a very cool moment for us, I would say, in our family and also in Black history, because to me, he is a living Black history moment, and you'll learn why he is that, not only just to me, but also for the state of Georgia. So Gary, I'll let you share more about your background.
Yeah, thanks, little cousin. Anyway, it's good to be here. I've been in the technology space for quite some time. I started off in the private sector with IBM, and if you're old enough to remember, you'll remember MCI WorldCom, which is now Verizon. And so from there, I moved actually into more government community work. So I most recently, actually before that, I was the chief information officer in Atlanta for the 26th largest school district in the country, which is DeKalb County School District. So I had a lot of work with a lot of diversified community work. It's a melting pot for the Southeast. I believe, if I can remember the statistics correctly, there are about 30, 30, 30, 10. So that's a pretty diverse school district with I think 96 different languages that were spoken. And from there, I moved on to the city of Atlanta as the chief information officer, which also covered Hartsfield-Jackson Airport. And so, of course, Atlanta is extremely diverse. And now I'm the chief information officer for Beazer Homes, which is one of the largest home developers and commercial developers in the U.S. So that's my quick story. Thanks.
Thank you, Gary. All right, so as I mentioned today, we are here to talk about the digital divide within our nation. So let's have a little bit of background. In this case, Paula, I'll kick it off with you, and Gary, you can answer the same question and build off, what Paula would share with us as well. So what exactly is digital equity in this case, Paula, for those who are not aware?
So digital equity is when any home, regardless if it's owned or rented, regardless of its members' age, gender, race, level of income, level of education, and marital status, the whole household should have access to a device, such as a tablet, know how to use it to their personal needs and advantage, all while not suffering financial hardship in order to own said device, connect it to the internet, to have broadband, and to improve their digital skills. So therefore, having this digital device and taking classes or improving their skills. Community leaders, should so I'll stop there. But yes, that's how I view digital equity, having the ability, in every single way, in 360 to utilize these devices and not, feel hardships financially because of them.
Thank you, Gary.
Yeah, that's a issue and question I've been asked a lot over the course of my career. And one of the things that I think is extremely important to know is a lot of people get it confused with equal, and it's really not the same thing. So, an example I would like to use is we had a program in the school district called Digital Dreamers. And what was really interesting is I felt like the kids in that community got it more than the parents. And so we were actually passing out laptops to 100,000 kids. And so in a county school district, you have the affluent, and then you have the impoverished. And so what ended up happening is when you pass out a laptop and you have money, this is the best way to explain it for me. And you have money and you already have a laptop in the home, you don't get it, because you already have it. The person that does, just because the person that is, needs help or doesn't have it gets it, you don't get to get it too. That's equal, right? If you're trying to level the playing field. And what was interesting about it is that, a lot of the resources that people already have in place that have the means to actually have those resources feel like if others are getting it, they should get it too. That's really, I used to have this graphic where it used to have, Evie used to have a tall person. I'm sure you've seen it, a person in the middle, and then a younger person. And so they would put the person on the smallest person on the box that couldn't see over the fence. And everybody else could stand and see over the fence without having to stand on the box. Well, they put boxes under each person, which then allowed that to become like equalized instead of really looking at it from the standpoint of equity. And I just think a lot of times we get caught up in, okay, yeah, I'm gonna provide you a device, but if you already have a device, right, and you're giving that next person, you're giving the person that doesn't have one a device, it's not equity. It's not. And so I think whether it's digital or whether it's not digital, and I'll just end with this, we have a lot of work to do to get people to really continue to understand what the definition of that is.
Thank you, Gary. So that's a perfect segue, Gary and Paula. In this case, when we were taking it further, discussing digital equity, and Paula, you were, starting to speak on this. What can our community leaders do? At TPMA, we are very solution oriented when we work with our stakeholders and our partners with the contracts that we have with workforce development, economic development, and in this case, diversity, equity, inclusion work too, that we implement in all of our projects. But Paola, what can we do, in this case with community engagement, how can that play a part, in developing digital equity and solutions?
Mm-hmm. Well, I'll give an example of what we're doing in South Carolina, excuse me, and there are quite a few efforts, and I'll speak specifically to the ones I'm involved in. One project we have is the digital economy ecosystem, and this is an endeavor with our partner, the South Carolina Rural Innovation Network, and it is to create a roadmap for the participating counties. And here's the thing, the counties who get to have this resource, we have to get funding for it. So the USDA provides the funding, and the funding is finite. And so we would love to provide this roadmap for more counties, but because it's so reduced, we look at priorities. And so we look at social determinants of health, and we look at more needed areas. Because we are the Office of Rural Health, we look at where communities are not showing that they're the most healthy and why. And a lot of times resources such as broadband affect a community's health, right? Community leaders, they engage in this project by giving feedback, by being interviewed by the facilitator. And through that engagement, through that transparency, they're able to create this roadmap with accompanying strategies for that specific county and that area. And so once they have this this document in the second year of the project, they dedicate themselves with a facilitator and other organizations to execute that roadmap, to satisfy those budgets so that there are different programs. And that's when we get into the equitable part. So through the community leaders, there's multi-sectors, and you have education, you have economic development, you have healthcare. And so you have all of these different, folks at the table. And so when this roadmap is crafted, in multiple levels, because there's also the feedback from grassroots, then you're able to have this plan where when money does become available, then they can prioritize schools or this skills training for those who already have finished high school. And so there's K through 12, post secondary opportunities as well. And then remote work. I mean, the list goes on, but so community leaders should maintain relationships with decision makers and then prioritize the equity to improve their fellow citizens' quality of life. And this, in the end, make an overlooked or disadvantaged town into a self-sufficient and attractive place to live and work.
Thank you. Gary, did you want to jump in on that?
Yeah, Megan, can you repeat the question again?
Yeah, so in this case, when we're thinking about, what should the top priorities be for community leaders, to be solution oriented around digital equity?
Yep, and I agree, and I want to make sure that, is it Paula?
Yeah.
All right, go ahead, I'm sorry.
You can say Paula or you can say Paula, whatever is most comfortable for you.
All right, how about I say PG? All right, that way I don't mess it up. All right, so one of the things, and I agree with you on that. You absolutely need. There's a ton of funding, but I don't necessarily think at this particular time there's a consistent roadmap to get this done. If you look across, even in Georgia right now, we just got done with the sessions here, and they're throwing, or we're still in the middle of them actually, and they're throwing money, all types of money to this problem. But at the same time, the community leaders, whether it's and it's a lot of synergy between city, state, and also the education institutions that especially in Georgia, that sit in Georgia. And one of the things that I tried to do with my time there was really look at this and become intentional about putting the right players around the table. And sometimes that's also the private sector. You have a lot of organizations that want this done, but they don't really know how to get it done. And I actually learned a lot about this and bringing groups together when we had the Super Bowl here a couple of years ago. And I had to lead that effort. And I really was able to see how you can take advantage of different private sector leaders within here that really want to do it, but there's no roadmap, no strategic plan to get this done. And if you go and you look out in the rural communities, you see a lot of gaps. You see a lot of gaps that really became noticeable during COVID. You really started to see the disparities there. And they were so wide and glaring that I really think it got people's attention, but I really don't think that it's stuck and that it's sticking, because we're looking at this. We're slowly moving back into our regular normal behavior. At least we're trying to. It won't ever go back to the same way, but I really think that from a strategic level, you have to be very, very, very intentional about it. And when you talk to leaders who are running for, and community leaders who are running for these types of positions that are impactful like that, you really have to understand why they're running and what they're running for, because those agendas are set and that money is tied to those agendas. They talk about it, but there's really never a plan for it, not even from a resource perspective when they're hiring. And so they want equity. Most of them are running on sidewalks. potholes, crime. And so, and the last thing I'll add is I think in DeKalb, we were really successful about that because we were able to get all of the leaders in the room to explain to them the economic impact that this can have if it's done correctly. And I think, having those statistics available to really be able to show how this, and even some of the services that we wanted to offer to our families and communities, they were so behind, they didn't even have devices to be able to take advantage of the services. So sometimes as community leaders, we get ahead from a technology perspective, not really understanding the needs of the community. And so it really does take both private and also public leaders being on the same page to get this done.
Thank you, Gary. And I want to take a pause because I made a very big mistake and did not introduce my peer, colleague, friend, and I would also say champion around diversity, equity, inclusion, Ms. Grace Heffernan. She's been sitting here and I did not introduce her. My apologies, Grace. And actually at this moment, I'm going to transition things over to Grace for our next questions for Gary and Paula. So Grace, my apologies. I just realized what I did.
That is a-okay. I actually was hoping that I would have this moment for an extra special introduction. So I think we were on the same brainwave for sure.
Take it away.
Megan, I know you mentioned that you were going to head over to some additional questions, but I've had the benefit of actually listening a little bit to Paula and Gary's comments, and I would love to just add on to them a little bit. And one of the things that really has resonated with me is this notion about the digital divide and whether it's a problem for individuals or if it's like a systemic issue. And in the last 2 years, I think we have seen an unprecedented acceleration in the ways in which American life is tied to the digital world. Working from home, school is oscillating between remote and in-person learning. Telehealth is on the rise. And in many ways, that's a really great thing. For instance, as I'm talking to you, I'm wearing leggings in my home office. So that's, that is wonderful. But it's really accelerated the negative impact and the extent to which the divide is impacting those with digital access and those without digital access. And so when we think about how leaders could or should approach the digital divide and building a more equitable digital community, I think it's really about this notion of focusing in on the fact that the digital divide is a structural issue. It is not a individual issue. And I'll just say that one more time. I think Gary said it, I think Paula said it, but this is a structural issue in need of systemic solutions. It cannot be solved through individual solutions. And so like what comes to mind as we're talking about that is what we've experienced in the last 2 years. We've experienced the Great Net Reckoning, which was the racial justice response to the murders of George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, and Breonna Taylor. We've also experienced the Great Resignation, where we saw workers opting out of business as usual in the labor market. We're seeing them choose better work, more fulfilling work, or leaving the labor market altogether, rather than stay in their current employment situation. And I can tell you that both of these events, the Great Reckoning and the Great Resignation, didn't happen overnight, didn't happen in a vacuum. They're absolutely the result of generations and generations of Americans seeing opportunity pass them by, pass their families by, and pass their communities by, which I'm really looking forward to hearing Paula talk more about later, about the ways in which communities should be at the center of all of our digital equity strategies. And so I will wrap this up. I'm making up for lost time here, but I think that when we think about like generations of missed opportunity, I know that can sound a little hyperbolic, but it's real. And I think we are going to start to see folks recognizing this and being more and more fed up with the status quo. And so I'll just say, I'm from Cleveland. Cleveland is a segregated city. White folks, they mostly live on the west side of our river. Black folks, they mostly live on the east side of the river. And across our city's east side, you can overlay the redlining maps that the federal government used to systemically exclude and discriminate Black GIs returning home from World War II from housing. You can overlay those maps 80 years later with the maps that show us where folks are least connected to the internet, where folks have the least access to hardware, software, and devices that keep them connected, and where folks have the least amount of digital skills. And so like that to me is telling this narrative in this story that the digital divide is really, it's a part of this legacy of missed opportunity and systemic exclusion that we have to push our leaders to be really, really thoughtful on. And to the point of business as usual, systemic exclusion is business as usual in the US. And so we are going to have to be really thoughtful and do things differently and continue to push leaders if we want to see the digital divide change in any real meaningful way. And so, yeah, that's, I guess, Gary and Paula just got me hyped up. I just feel like I wanted to come in as your hype woman on all those comments. So thanks. And I'll hand it over to you, Megan.
Well, thank you, Grace. And this is why everyone, I love working with Grace because of her perspective and her experience and her, reality that she always shares, around her, in this case in Cleveland. So I'm not sure if we touched on the infrastructure bill at all. Grace, were you going to jump in on that?
Yeah, absolutely. Just what everyone wants for me to talk a little bit more. So let me provide just a little bit of detail about what's going on and how communities can begin to address digital equity with funds that are coming through the federal government. Since President Biden took office in 2021, we have seen some significant investments in a number of areas and addressing some of the biggest challenges in American life right now. So in March of 2021, you had the American Rescue Plan that was passed, which was a $1.9 trillion package, sweeping recovery legislation to deal with the aftermath of the pandemic. Then in the fall of last year, the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act was passed. This was a $1.2 trillion spending package that is focused on a couple of key areas. So first and primarily the types of infrastructure that you typically think of, right? Repairing our roads, our bridges, our highways. There was also dollars in there for improving transportation for Americans, upgrading our power infrastructure with clean energy, provisions for climate change. And there's also a significant amount of money for clean water access for American families and upgrading our country's lead service lines, which if you want to talk about redlining, again, you could talk about where our communities are being impacted with unsafe, unclean, lead poisoned water. But that is a story for another day. And so finally, then we've got this $65 billion allocated so that Americans can have access to reliable, high-speed internet. And this $65 billion, first of all, it's unprecedented. We have never seen this type of investment in broadband access and beginning to close the digital divide. And so while I would love to tell you today that we are going to be able to see this money used in a lot of different ways, I would say there's about 4 main buckets that we can expect to see this money used, or 4 main buckets of ways in which we can expect to see this money used. So about $42 billion is going to be about broadband access and deployment. So that's like the physical infrastructure component of broadband. The next tranche is roughly $15 billion and is focused on affordable connectivity and middle mile connectivity. So those are fairly prescribed tranches of money that deal with physical infrastructure of broadband access. And then there is this $2.75 billion investment in digital equity. Again, this is unprecedented. And it is when we think about systemic solutions, it is beginning to be the type of money and to think in the type of scale that we will need to be able to deal with these issues of digital equity and access in a really real way. And so I know some of you here, I hope most of you here are like thinking, okay, get to it, Grace. Like, I want to know how to spend this money in my community so that we can begin to see better and different and more positive outcomes for people who are not connected to the internet currently. And so I will tell you a couple of headlines. So the first is that this $2.75 billion is being distributed through two tranches of grant money. The first is through a state digital equity capacity grant. Each state will have an opportunity to develop a comprehensive digital equity plan to outline the barriers to digital equity in their community, the measurable objectives that they want to see for increasing digital inclusion, and also a description of their plans to interact with stakeholders. Based on this comprehensive plan, states will be eligible for a piece of something like $1.5 billion. This money, for the most part, is coming to states regardless. So on one hand, that's great, right? It's not ultra competitive dollars. On the other, we as leaders in our community really still want to spend time and push our state leaders to make sure that we have those comprehensive plans in place that we know are going to be responsive to community need. The second tranche of money is about $1.25 billion, and it is a competitive grant process that is available for added capacity to those comprehensive digital access plans that all states will need to submit. And so I think I'll leave it there because I know Paula has some really great ideas to talk a little bit about sort of how can we take these incredible state investments and make them real at the local level. So that's it.
All right. So the question is, who has the funding? Who makes the decisions? And what strategic plans are currently in place, which would help these the plans that you just discussed with the equity plans. So the more prepared the communities are, the better. From my understanding, there's perhaps a nice participation of economic development. And in my experience, we have had the participation of economic developers, local government, Chamber of Commerce, in addition to education and just educational institutions to look at how these decisions are going to be made. And of course, it's important to have the representation of the community, because what can happen is if you don't have a community that is involved, whether it's community leaders or not, then decisions are made for you. And questions need to be asked, such as what's going to be done with this money? Who has it? Because some folks aren't really clear who is managing this money. And what are the strategic plans? And it's okay to ask questions. Why is funding going to this and not to that? Because unfortunately, I'm going to talk about some of the ugly things, and it can be either rural or urban. You've got partnerships, but the wrong type of partnerships. You've got buddy systems, and you've got favors. I mean, it's not in all areas, but it can still happen. You can have money being prioritized in a certain way, and the community didn't have a say so because there's already some sort of agreement in place between organizations or peers that might not benefit the whole community. So there's that. And then you also need to take into account like whose voice will be heard when you're providing solutions on how this funding is going to be dispersed. And I mentioned earlier, having this multi-sector involvement, because when money trickles down from national to state and then local, in some cases it gets so complicated about where the money is going and who decides where it's going to be allocated. And for this reason, public-private partnerships and local government must be inclusive and transparent, right? That's a request that you should have and that you should provide depending on who everyone in the audience. And then in some communities, that's not easy to achieve. I mentioned, some things that happen in some areas. And in addition to collaborations is staying informed as a collective in the event transparency and inclusion are not standard pillars. Because when you know when money is coming in, when to anticipate it, and to know what your strategic plans are. And so if there's a strategic plan that is visible to the community, which should be, and it shows that money is going towards equity, some activities that would improve equity, then you want to hold accountability to ensure that these action steps are taken. So it's a lot of homework, and it's not a size fits all. I think Gary said it very well. There's not a roadmap that you can just pull down from the toolkit and everyone use it. These roadmaps should be catered to each community, because each community has different strengths and needs. And like he said, some people already have their PCs, their tablets, and have some education. They don't need that, but some other community does. And so, sometimes I wonder, why some, in the case in my work, rural areas, why do some of these rural areas still have issues with sustaining a business? I have a perfect example where there's a community and they are really doing their best to keep up with digital resources, and they don't want to be on the wrong end of the digital divide. And one of the barriers they have is the price of their internet connection. They have to pay, I want to say $500 or $600 to stay open. And this is an honest business that wants to provide a space for its community to work and learn, and they shouldn't be penalized. So going back to how this money is managed and what should be done when this money comes into the community, taking into account these businesses, the people in the community, the children, does the community have STEAM and STEM programs? If they don't, this is the perfect opportunity for looking at digital equity and education, to integrate classes. And I'm not saying adding on a digital literacy class, because I know that many of you have seen some programs that, a program from wherever it may be goes to a school and say, hey, we have this, nutrition program. Let's put this nutrition program into your already packed schedule for the kids. And so the teachers now have to cut some time out of a necessary class, or cut into gym time, or extend the day, to put these programs in. We don't want that for digital literacy or anything related to digital, because we believe, and what should happen is that you take all these subjects, let's say math, social studies, English, and that there should be a component where digital skills are integrated into all of these subjects, where it's not disruptive, but enhancing. So those are just examples on how, the communities can look at, the equity through the eyes of the community, and also looking at how the quality of life of your community is going to improve, and how that community can become self-sustainable, perhaps reducing commute times. If you have more, Grace said it, she's in her leggings. People have the right to work in their leggings, or their shorts or their flip flops, right? It shouldn't be just the haves. The have-nots should have a lot of these opportunities, for their children to aspire to, the jobs coming. We've got on the horizon in web 3, right? We're already been talking about digital currency. We're already talking about the metaverse. Super Bowl had I think some commercials where they were talking about the metaverse, and then there's another commercial saying we need to focus on reality and saving the planet. So there is a balance, but we also need to be prepared for these future jobs, and allowing for all communities to take part in these future jobs, and not only jobs, but just the different benefits.
Thank you, Paula. And you just actually, jogged my memory of just thinking back to the pandemic, even just a year ago with my daughter. She started kindergarten during the pandemic. And when she was forced to stay home and not be able to be in the classroom, all the children were given Chromebooks in this case for their studies. And, I can imagine, granted, I have, the honor of being able to work from home and work remotely, through TPMA, but thinking about those other parents who don't have that same, opportunity as I have to be able to stay at home while their children were here during, with them during the pandemic, and then being able to balance, in this case, work, and then helping your child to log on to their own Zoom classrooms or their own Google Classrooms in this case. And like I said, I had a kindergartner back then. So the first week was a bit of a struggle for me, of her knowing when to log in, when to log out, how to mute herself, how to unmute herself, giving her my office, and then going over to, in my kitchen or family room to work. So then that way she can have a nice quiet space, because she and I learned quickly, we're not able to work together, because in this case, I'm trying to have Zoom calls, and then I can hear 20 other kids asking their mom and dad, Mom, Dad, can you please help me? Or even just being interrupted, myself with my child. It took her a good while to be able to get acclimated with having Zoom. In this case, I really do wonder about the next generation. She's Generation Z in this case, what the workforce is going to look like for them, because they have, learned how to log on to Zoom, learned how to keep a schedule in this case, even looking at her own outlook for her studies. So it's going to be very interesting in the future to see what our workforce looks like with our children, and, what all this has caused, in this case, the pandemic. Gary, I'll pause there and I'll let you jump into, and how we can, I know you touched on it a little bit about, spending of money and money being available, but, what would you like to see in this case regarding this $65 billion that we have around digital equity?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I really do think you can't, I think the solution has always been throwing money at it. And although this spend is unprecedented, or this amount of money is unprecedented, like Grace said, I don't necessarily believe that the problem will be fixed like it needs to be fixed unless I've seen this successful in pockets. So one of the, at least, advantages of being in the city is I was able to travel all around the world, and I was able to see other cities and countries, and actually some of them are actually doing this pretty well. And one that surprised me was actually Vietnam. And when I was over there and I was looking at this, of course, they don't have to tear down old infrastructure to build new infrastructure, because they really didn't have any. But one of the things that they did was they did not release the funds to the specific areas unless there was a plan with actionable items that could be tracked along the plan. And I think they were very intentional about it. You have to be intentional about it. And I think we release money a lot, millions and millions of dollars, in this case, trillions of dollars, without much expectation from the people that we're releasing it to. I feel like the federal government does have an obligation in this, and it's not just to release money. It's also to help provide that roadmap for communities. It's also to do their research across different countries to see, we talk so much about the US, but there are countries with less resources that are making this happen. And, and they're making it happen faster than we are. And so in some cases, it's shameful to me. And one of the things that I felt stood out in that was the fact that the funds were not released until there was a plan that was approved by the government that could be tracked, monitored, and followed. A lot of times we release it to our local communities, and although they want it, they haven't really put the effort in place to really have a plan that everybody agrees on that can be followed and tracked and measured. Most of them don't even know. I was in a leadership program, and most of them didn't even know who their school board member was that they actually put in place, not really understanding that DeKalb had a $3 billion annual operating budget, and those board members were responsible for those funds. And so unless you have a true plan in place to get this done, that is approved by the federal government, I don't really think that the funds should be released to you. And that's just my personal opinion on it. And from what I've seen across the world around what works and what doesn't work. So that's really my we have to have plans, not just plans, but plans that can be tracked and measured, and that have to be available and that the community has access to see. It needs to be a very transparent process across the board. And I think that would be the start of us really making some ground on this issue.
Thank you, Gary. Paula, go ahead.
Sorry, yeah, I wanted to mention something I almost forgot about that's very important in this whole process. And Gary made me think about it when he said, when he was talking, and it's the broadband maps. Many states have made a huge effort to create maps showing best available technology, gaps in service, but caution, some of these maps aren't accurate. And so it's important for whatever state you're in to look at these maps and to look at areas that perhaps say they're served or they're not prioritized, to go to the entity that is creating these maps and talk to them about that so they can alter that information, because in many instances, those maps could be used for these funding opportunities. Also, we at our office, we got some funding from the CDC, and it went to our Department of Environment. I can't miss the DHEC. I'll say DHEC because I'm going to mess it up right now, but it's environmental health. And then it came to us for rural specific reasons. And then we dispersed a lot of that money through grants. And so that way the community could be involved. So we created requests for proposals, and then that allows the community to apply, to have a strategic plan, to tell us or whoever it is what Gary was said also it's of utmost importance, and that's tracking the data, what's happening with this funding, where is it going to, and how is it changing the community. And from our perspective is how can broadband improve quality of life, right, and improve health in different ways. So yeah, definitely the broadband maps, and also I think a community effort that's important helping these broadband maps is doing the speed tests, because the speed tests will help identify what your speed is, and that data goes in. But if I'm not mistaken, and Gary, you should probably know with your background, I think there's a certain amount of time that needs to go by so that the data is correctly captured. I think is it 45 seconds?
That's correct. Yep.
Yeah.
Well, thank you, Paula, for that input as well. We're coming up to, the final countdown of our webinar. Thank you again, everyone who has joined us, and thank you again to our panelists. I will, if you have a question, please drop it in the chat at this moment before we close out. But our final question in this case that I have for our panelists, and along with Grace, in this case, we're talking about, what we can do in our community. And I know, Paula, you mentioned the whole broadband test and what we can do to test the speed. But in this case, when I think about communities, I think about collaboration with our community-based organizations and who is directly connected to the folks in that community. Not everyone's going to feel comfortable in understanding when you say, let's do a broadband test to see how fast your internet is, or in this case, how can they do the test if they don't have access to a device to test if their internet speed is fast or slow. In this case, I know there are surveys that they can complete in different communities and such, but working with our community based organizations and those folks who are able to get that information to folks in the community, I feel is going to be key. So my final question to you all is, what collaborations will be required to successfully dispense or get stakeholders involved, share the money, what are some comprehensive solutions and some final thoughts that you can share with us today? And I guess Paula, you just got done speaking, so I'll kick it off to Gary, and then we'll finish with Paula.
No, I think a combination of everything that was said today is extremely important. I think the first thing you need to do is understand who is in charge of the money. Where's the money going? I think you need to first familiarize yourself with the Build Back Better bill. I think is what they call it. You need to be extremely familiar with it, understand when that money's coming, the allocations that are going out, and who it's going to. I think secondly, you need to understand the priorities and you need to I'll say it this way, you need to understand the priorities and what the people that you voted in office in your communities care about. A lot of times everybody doesn't care about it. And I just want to make that plain. And a lot of times they find other ways to use that money. So really understanding who you have in office is really going to determine a lot about what the priorities are going to be with that money, and also really understand if there's any plans that are already in place, as Paola said. I think that goes a long way. I think once you have that in place, then get involved. It's not a one person show, but I think that the more you can inform the community about this and what's happening, half of the people that this is going to affect don't even really have access to this information like we do, which is pretty interesting. And so I think that's one of the important pieces. I remember, and I'll be quiet after this. We were talking about changing the city of Atlanta into a digital city hall, right? And we did the statistics and the math, and we found out that half of the services that we offer that the community needs, most of them wouldn't even have access to it. And so, a lot of times we get out in front with these grand ideas, but we leave everybody else behind that really needs it. So I think that's just extremely important. But I would start with really understanding the bill. It's a lot packed inside of it. And then I think once you understand it, you will have a better compass and roadmap for where you need to go from there.
Paula, did you want to jump in on that? I do see a couple of questions coming through. Go ahead.
So everything that Gary said, plus the hard part is finding who is doing this work, who are the folks leading these efforts. And I think some good starting places are, good old Google search. If you're in, I don't know, Michigan Digital Equity Plan, right? Or in many cases, telehealth has been such a monumental component to digital equity because, before the pandemic, a lot of people needed telehealth because of healthcare access, not so much because of COVID, just because if they're in a rural area and they need specialty services and they can't drive, excuse me, the hour, 2 hours to a certain appointment, And so I think that in addition to making that Google search, also reaching out to a telehealth entity in your area, in your state, and I think that they would point you in the right direction. And then broadband offices. So there's definitely a lot of investigative work. Hopefully, folks don't have to investigate too much. But those are great starting points to find out, what is being done with the money, because chances are, if it's telehealth, economic development, the chamber, or libraries, they're involved in some way in these conversations.
Thank you. And one question that's come through in our chat is, what responsibility do providers have in regards to, the accuracy of the maps that we were talking about in the speed testing? In this case, the providers of the broadband, what responsibility do they have? And I think, Paula, we discussed a little bit about this during your collaborative meeting, either last week or the month before. Did you want to share any information that you could share about that, or Gary in this case?
My answer is short because I don't know 100%. I just know that we do have some partners on these calls who are ISPs, and I believe there are some limitations. They want to help communities more, and I need to really ask them more about what those limitations are, because I did come across a resource, and Grace, you mentioned redlining. How can we prevent further redlining when it comes to providers? How much of an issue is that going to be? We already saw the redlining with, mainly housing. So how can we prevent further redlining when it comes to, digital resources and when this money is dispersed? But I'll let Gary jump in if he, to supplement, what the responsibility ISPs and other providers have in updating the maps.
Yeah, they have a huge responsibility. And they've actually, at least I know a lot of the work that I've done, and I'll just name some with Verizon, Sprint, T-Mobile, now, they're very interested in getting this done. I do think that some of the frustration that they had is with some of the things that we talked about today is that although they have the ability to do it, they don't necessarily control the entire outcome of it. And so when you really look in, I'll say it again, when you really look at your state leadership, your local level leadership, they really have the power to really get this, to help get this done. I would say this, they wanted to put, and I think we saw an example of this with the airports. If you've been paying attention, the airports have been wanting to install 5G inside of the airports. And if you look at what the holdup is, or what the problem is there's a lot of red tape between what they need to do and what the federal government will grant them the ability to do. And they're actually a lot further in this process, in that example, a lot further forward thinking than we are. We were holding them back from using 5G. They wanted to put 5G inside of the airport, and the Super Bowl allowed them to do that as an experiment. But now there's all types of communication issues that are happening. So it's not always as simple as the providers laying a pathway in order to do it. There's permitting that needs to happen within each city. There's local jurisdiction from city councils that have to pass this type of stuff. And I get back to understanding what the priorities are, that the people that you vote into office, what are their priorities and what do they care about? We saw, as an example, it took a lot of time, even with the Build Back Better bill. We've seen the politics play out right in front of us, just trying to get it approved. So those politics will play out, at the local level, and sometimes the providers get caught up in the middle of it. But I do know they are able and willing and available to do it. It's just, it's going to take that fight in order to get it done, and really some common ground on understanding how important this is.
Thank you. Well, we are now at the 5-minute mark of our webinar. What I am going to do is allow our panelists to have any final words that they would like to share with us. Paula, I'll start with you first. Anything that you would like to share, what we can do in our communities, how we can be collaborative, and any next steps that you can share with us.
From a community point of view or perspective, rather, I think it's important to be transparent and inclusive when you're looking at funding and equitable, digital equity, education, digital literacy, the whole gamma. Because without the inclusion and the transparency, then you're not going to get the outcomes that would be most beneficial for the community. And yeah, good luck to all of you. You might have to do some investigative work and get some closed doors, but hopefully it's not going to be too long of a process, and you can get a group together or become involved in a group in your area so that you can move forward with the plans that you address.
Thank you. And Gary, I'll let you jump in. Anything that you can share with us next, best steps, best practices that you can share around digital equity and literacy as well.
Yep, just get involved in your community. You can have a lot more impact than you think. We're not going to solve this problem overnight. It didn't start overnight. But I will say we can have pockets of success with this. And by you getting involved, just maybe, we'll have a blueprint or at least a piece of a blueprint to really tag on to really get this done across the U.S. Sometimes it starts in just one community. And, and once we're able to see the possibilities of that, at the end of the day, it can also permeate to the rest of society. And so just get started. Every little footprint that you make on this matters.
Thank you. Grace, do you have any final words?
My final thought is maybe a little pragmatic. I think Gary made this great point about the importance of these comprehensive state plans that states are going to have the opportunity to make to determine how they want to spend this digital equity funding. Those plans are going to be critical in determining the future of digital equity in our country. And I know that there are a couple of specific questions in the chat. If folks want to know more about those plans, if folks would like some context or background, I'd be happy to do that. You can follow up with TPMA and we can get you additional information because it's never too early to start getting in front of your state leaders to think about really what these plans are going to look like and who needs to be at the table. So that would be my pitch.
Thank you, Grace. All right, well, we have come to the completion of our webinar around the digital divide. I want to thank all of our panelists, Paula Gutierrez and Gary Brantley, for joining us, and Grace Heffernan, my colleague from TPMA. As we mentioned before, if you have any additional questions, feel free to reach out to us. Also, just so you know, this webinar will go live on our YouTube channel, possibly sometime this week or next week. So if you want to, play it back or share it with your colleagues and friends, by all means do so. We thank you again for joining us at TPMA, Thomas P. Miller and Associates, and kicking off our first webinar of 2022. Please be on the lookout for additional webinars coming throughout the year. And by all means, have a great day and an awesome remainder of Black History Month. And thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.